All right, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining our webinar today, where we'll look at emerging state strategies to fast-track EV infrastructure projects. My name is Mari Hernandez, and I'm the Interim VP of IREC's regulatory program. IREC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to build the foundation for rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. We fulfill our mission through three different focus areas: workforce development, local initiatives, and regulatory engagement. IREC's regulatory team has been building the foundation for streamlined grid integration policies for the better part of 2 decades. Historically, for us, that has meant working on state interconnection rules for distributed generation projects. However, within the last 2 years, we've been fortunate to be able to cover the grid connection process, or what we call the energization process for load projects, and particularly medium and heavy duty EV charger projects. So this is what we're covering today, and I'm excited to introduce my fellow panelists. First, we have Dave Golombeski, who is a senior program manager at IREC and works to improve interconnection and energization rules and utility practices through both direct engagement in state regulatory proceedings and through the development of foundational resources, including our resource that we co-develop with Vote Solar called Freeing the Grid, which grades states on their interconnection rules compared to best practices. Dave is the policy lead for our flexible interconnection work as well, and has been participating in working groups to advance streamlined and cost-effective policies. Next, we have Midhat Mafazi, who is a regulatory program engineer who has been instrumental in shaping IREC's technical policy work and has been our leading expert on hosting capacity analysis, which we'll get more into today. And finally, Casey Horan is an attorney with the Environmental Defense Fund, where she advocates for federal, regional, and state policies that promote climate action, equitable access to clean energy, grid modernization, and environmental justice. EDF is a national organization. EDF is a nonprofit organization that works to stabilize the climate, strengthen the ability of people and nature to thrive, and support people's health. We're so glad to have Casey here, since we've been working with EDF in many states to address energization timelines and flexible service connection in particular. So in this next section, we structured this as a panel-style discussion, and we'll go through each of these topics on the screen in more depth. We chose these 3 topics because they've emerged as potential ways to improve the energization process that can reduce delays and offer benefits to customers. This obviously doesn't encompass all of the topic areas in which we or EDF focus our efforts, but does represent some of the solutions that should be considered by stakeholders who want to identify strategies that can be used to understand and address energization process challenges. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave to get us started.
So the first topic that we will go over is energization timelines. And just so for some background, what we mean by that is regulatory targets or deadlines that require utilities to complete energization process steps within a specified timeframe. And ideally, this is paired with commission-mandated tracking and reporting of those energization process timelines. And so there's several ways that these timelines can be structured, and the panelists may dive into that in their answers. But these timelines can cover each step in the energization process. So, for example, there is at the beginning of the process, there is typically an application completeness step, where the utility determines if that application is complete or if it's missing some data or some documents. There's also the engineering and technical review step. So each of those steps could have its own timeline for the utility to complete it. It could be 10 days, 20 days. So that's on one side. And then on the other side, you could have end-to-end timelines. And so that would be a timeline that requires the entire energization process to be completed within a certain time frame. And so with that, I want to ask questions to Casey and Mari about energization timelines. So first question for them is, Why is it important for states and utilities to track energization timelines and or set up timeline targets?
So I can start with this one. Um, you can't improve what you don't first understand. At EDF, we're advocating for tracking energization timelines because we have to understand how long these processes take. And there's a lot of considerations that you have to factor in order to like form different baselines for different customer classes and different project classes. So yeah, you need that visibility into utility performance trends to first understand what the barriers actually are to speeding energization timelines.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think what also is really important, and we've seen this in our other work on distributed generation projects, is utility accountability. So whether it's tracking timelines or setting up mandated timelines with required reporting, stakeholders then have the ability to analyze utility performance and recommend improvements based on actual performance data. So that kind of goes back to that visibility thing that Casey was talking about. And importantly, mandated timelines or targets can help to set expectations for how long the process will take and provide applicants with something to measure their experience against and to ask regulators to address if the utility is not meeting the timelines. So it's really important for that side of it as well.
And so then what are the challenges related to tracking or setting the timelines?
I can start us off on this one as well. There's quite a lot of challenges to setting energization timelines. The first that comes to mind is like how you track a timeline because you could track it step by step. So for instance, like from the time that it takes for the customer to submit the application to the application starting to be processed by the utility, or you can look at like the whole timeline. So there's a lot of debate back and forth on like what is the best way to even track like a single timeline versus step-by-step timelines. There's also, debate about how you differentiate between delays that arise from the utility versus delays that arise from the customer side of the process. In the California energization timelines proceeding, it's a lot of back and forth on like who is to blame when a customer's application is incomplete. Is that where the delay is coming from versus like what's under the utility's control? Yeah, and then there's also debate about whether you factor in upstream upgrades into the overall timelines because those delays tend to be very different or like much longer timelines compared to regular distribution upgrades. And then, yeah, looking at different types of projects. Are we going to set the same kind of timelines for an EV charger versus of different sizes or of different like energy requirements? And then like how you actually want to like look at the timeline and set those timelines to be equitable and fair. So there's been debate about whether it's better to have like an average timeline that utilities would shoot for versus like maximum timeline that they would have to hit. Um, so yeah, we've gone back and forth a lot on like what is fair, what is equitable, but like first just understanding what those delays are and like how they're rising is the most important thing.
Yeah, and I'd say, just in stepping back from our perspective of trying to like just get these types of things adopted in states, I think, this is in a lot of places a very new practice to track timelines on the load sides on the service connection process. So just getting that new practice in can be challenging. Um, so what's cool is that we have some organizations working on this through the legislative side to make sure that this is addressed, which can help kind of move that along. And then our work on IREC's regulatory team is to really engage in the regulatory process in states and help with implementation. So we've worked on adoption of timelines required by statute, and we're also pushing for timeline tracking and reporting beyond those efforts, just again to understand, what is actually going on in the process and how we can, make sure that we're looking at where are the delays occurring. So for comparison, I mentioned this a little bit before on the distributed generation side, most states have timelines listed for at least some of the interconnection steps that, it helps to provide certainty for customers for utility controlled steps. And also it provides some certainty to utilities for steps the customer is responsible for. So that goes back to some of what Casey was saying about how you track those timelines. This is really, timeline tracking and reporting is really what we consider to be a best practice for ensuring process efficiency and accountability. And obviously it has precedent in standardized interconnection procedures. So it's really just how do we get this to the load connection side or the energization side. So we've been working on that on our end. And then the other challenge for mandated timelines is making sure they're ambitious enough and aligned with state policy goals. And that can get really tricky. So that there's a whole challenge there in and of itself. But because that really requires some analysis to understand current charger deployment and where and how many chargers are need to be installed over time to meet transportation electrification or decarbonization goals. And we're calling this type of analysis really the pace of energization. Those are pace of energization type studies. And we're actually working with EDF and other groups to look at how we may be able to develop some resources to provide direction to states to help with that type of analysis. But we think that could be really important going forward, especially when you're looking at setting targets. Are those in line with what your state is saying you need to meet in terms of transportation electrification, in terms of decarbonization? So I think that's where a lot of states need to look as well going forward.
And so are there examples of states or utilities that have adopted energization timelines or required timeline tracking?
They haven't adopted it in the strictest sense that California has, but there are states that are working on grid modernization proactively. So some examples would be Colorado recently passed its Powering Up Colorado Act, which is a grid modernization act that includes energization timeline tracking as part of it. There's also the Powering Up Illinois Act, which is a version of the same act, which was included under the CRGA. And then there's also efforts to study the issue in Washington State and in DC. But overall, I'd say that a lot of states are considering grid modernization. Other states aren't seeing the same kind of capacity constraints that California is at the moment, but it is just a matter of time until other states need to address energization timelines, especially in the Northeast, Texas. They're going to see more and more bottlenecks coming online as we see more vehicle electrification and other end use electrification.
Yeah, and one of the things we learned working in Nevada over the past year is that the commission there had implemented timelines for some projects back in 2022 within their Rule 9 or their load extension or line extension rule, sorry. So the projects that are included are standard projects. So those are projects less than 1 megawatt or with estimated construction costs under $400,000. So given that some of the larger EV charging projects, which we've been focused on, our focus has tended to be more on the medium and heavy duty EV chargers, that those may not fall under those thresholds, the 1 megawatt threshold or the $400,000. So these are kind of typically less complex projects that currently have the timelines around them, around the different process steps. So IREC worked with NV Energy to get them to track timelines for larger or more complex projects just for a 1 year period. So starting in January of 2026, to then understand how long the process is taking for some of those larger or more complex projects. So that'll be, good, again, for that visibility into what that process looks like. And then that will be reported out by NV Energy next year. And then in New York, the commission adopted, I haven't seen this anywhere else, they adopted a transportation electrification interconnection timeline earnings adjustment mechanism. It's a mouthful, just for Con Edison, one of the utilities in New York. So this approach through an earnings adjustment mechanism provides incentives to Con Ed if the utility reduces energization timelines for projects 300 kilowatts and larger. And it measures those timelines. It's end to end, so from application to energization, based on the different types of services and upgrades required. So it has like 6 different categories that they're looking at for those timelines. But so those were a couple of other examples that look, they're a little bit different, just, you know, kind of limited in scope and also limited to just one utility in New York.
Okay, great. Thanks. Now we can move on to the next portion of our discussion and move on to grid transparency. And so what I mean by grid transparency is publicly available tools and resources that help customers determine whether EV charging stations are economically viable at a particular location. And we have listed 2 examples of those types of tools. So one of them is capacity checks. And this is when a utility engineer conducts a capacity analysis prior to application submittal. So the customer has a real indication of capacity at the site or at multiple sites. And the second tool is a hosting capacity analysis. And this is a tool that provides a snapshot of the availability of grid hosting capacity at various locations on the grid. And with that, I'm going to ask some questions of Midhat. So what are grid transparency tools such as capacity checks and hosting capacity analysis needed by load customers such as EV charging station projects?
So thanks, Dev. So at a high level, these tools, they're about reducing the uncertainty early on in the development process, which is especially critical for EV charging projects. EV developers typically site projects based on transportation needs, customer demand, and real estate, not the grid. The challenge is that grid capacity is often sort of a black box until fairly late in the game, usually after submitting an interconnection request. That can lead to situations where a project looks viable on paper, but ends up requiring significant upgrades or even long timelines or high cost. So the grid transparency tools like the hosting capacity maps and capacity checks help shift that interconnection or that information upstream in the process. They sort of allow developers to screen multiple sites quickly, identify areas where the grid is likely to be constrained, and avoid locations where upgrades are almost certain. So from an HCA perspective, the tools provide early warning systems for the grid. They don't tell you everything. They don't tell or they don't replace detailed engineering review that may be required, but they do help you avoid walking straight into a wall.
Right. And what design features make grid transparency tools most useful for EV charging station projects and other large load customers?
I would say the most useful tools tend to strike a balance between simplicity and meaningful technical insight, which is harder than it sounds. But I would say there are maybe 4 to 5 design features that are most useful. First, developers need clear location-specific visibility. You basically want to be able to look at a map and quickly get a sense of whether a site is promising or problematic without needing a PhD in power systems to interpret it. So it would be user-friendly. Second, it's important to show what is driving the constraints on that location. So for EV load or even for DER, that could be thermal limits that are associated with the conductors or transformers, voltage constraints, or protection limits. That context matters because it influences whether a constraint is likely to require minor upgrade or major system investments. And then third, I would say, which is truer for larger projects, tools such as these or such as the HCA include upstream should include upstream visibility. Sometimes everything may look fine at the circuit level, but the real limitation is sitting at the substation, and that usually is discovered later than anyone would like. So knowing the substation location and the rating of that substation transformer as well as the voltage class. Then fourth, I would say transparency around assumptions and limitations is also critical. So basically having a user guide that is associated with the map or FAQs that tells you more information, what is included, what is assumed as input, and what is not assumed. And finally, and I would end with this one, it's very important. It's about usability. If the tool is difficult to navigate, developers simply won't use it. Or even worse, they'll use it incorrectly. So the goal is not just to publish the data, but to create something that actually supports sort of real world siting decisions from the projects.
Right. So how should grid transparency tools evolve as electric vehicle adoption accelerates and large new loads begin connecting to the distribution system?
So I think that this is where things are starting to get interesting. Historically, hosting capacity analysis, or HCA, has been focused on DERs, especially solar exports. But now with transportation electrification, we are seeing rapid growth in large concentrated loads, and the tools need to evolve to reflect that. So a few key directions that stand out is first, we need more visibility into load hosting capacity, not just generation. Developers want to know, can the grid support my load? Not just can it absorb exports. So more and more jurisdictions are starting to offer the load HCA maps in addition to the generation maps. But still, there may be locations that are just offering the maps, the generation maps version. Then secondly, I would say the tools should become more forward-looking. And that's where the concept of proactive hosting capacity comes into play. So basically, you're looking at planned upgrades and future conditions. And then any additions of known loads are reflected on the maps. So some utilities already offer that feature, looking at the future HCA, where you can toggle into the map into future years, next 4 or 5 years, and you can see whether a capacity changes or whether you want to wait for your project until when capacity has changed. Third, better representation of time varying conditions. As we all know, the grid is dynamic. HCA does not need to be static or having just one value for the whole year. EV charging is not constant also. It can be time dependent. So capturing that dynamic behavior can lead to more realistic and sometimes even more optimistic capacity assessments. And fourth, I would say improve the visibility into upstream and system-wide constraints. As I mentioned, EV loads can be large. As EV load scales, the bottlenecks are increasingly not just local, they are system level. So more visibility into constraint at the substation and subtransmission level are increasingly becoming more valuable. And this goes to what I mentioned earlier about visibility into the substation transformer, the substation location, as well as the voltage class rating of that transformer, which gives you a better idea of what sort of upgrades you should expect. So in general, I would say from IREC's perspective, this evolution is really about moving from static screening tools into more planning-oriented tools. And there are several jurisdictions that are starting to move into that direction.
And what are some states that are leading the way on grid transparency tools?
So I'll say California, New York, and even Nevada all provide nodal level data, so like section specific data for HCA. And they provide maps for both generation and load. So they are worth highlighting and have lots of cool features in them. California specifically, I say, is often seen as a leader. They instead of HCA, they call it ICA there. So the ICA tools they provide have really set the foundation for grid transparency, especially for DERs. And nowadays, they are increasingly being looked at through a load lens as well. They are by far the most user-friendly tools that you can see out there, and they contain a lot of good attributes that IREC typically advocates for. There are still some issues with the ICAs in California that IREC and others are working with the utilities to resolve, but the maps are user-friendly and widely used. Next one I'll say is New York. Also has made strong progress through its hosting capacity maps and even the broader grid modernization efforts, with a focus on making the data from the grid more accessible and actionable. But I'll also note that the frequency of updates could improve in New York. Nevada, so NV Energy maps are pretty decent as well. They even includes future HCA considerations on the map, where you can toggle into future years, as I mentioned earlier. The one thing that maybe compared to California, if you're looking at the Nevada maps, is that their lacking is in terms of the dynamic or time value HCA or time series HCA that is offered in California but not in Nevada. But all these three jurisdictions or states that I mentioned, they provide decent looking maps.
Great, thanks. Now I'll hand it over to Mari to facilitate the rest of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Midhat. That was great. Before I move on to just flexible service connection, just wanted to thank folks for putting questions in the Q&A. I realized I went to the toolbar on my screen and I had to click more to find the Q&A box. So if you haven't seen it and only see the chat, just click on that little more box and it opens up and you can see some different options, and then click on the Q&A if you'd like to submit questions. Yeah, so on flexible service connections, I think one of the things we're thinking about here is that as more EV chargers and other load projects connect to the grid, many projects may face delays because the grid just doesn't have enough capacity to serve those projects right away. So flexible service connection is really an emerging strategy that offers a way to connect these projects sooner using limits at the project, like limiting the amount of power that a project receives, either temporarily while grid upgrades are completed or longer term to avoid grid upgrades altogether. So to get into more details about that, I'm going to ask some questions of Dave and Casey. And so to start us off, what are the benefits of flexible service connection to load customers?
Yeah, I can take this one to start. So EDF has been working a lot on flexible service connections in a number of states, and we frame a lot of our advocacy around the benefits, which often include faster energization being the most obvious. So people get connected faster, and we're seeing like that, especially in the cases of things like EV chargers, people can interconnect at a lower capacity than the peak. So this can also help defer and potentially avoid upstream upgrades. So when we see flexible service connections implemented as bridging solution, which means that it's temporary until the upstream upgrades are completed, that's at least deferring the upstream upgrade. But potentially long-term, we want to see flexible service connections implemented not as just bridging solutions, so as long-term solutions that can potentially avoid an upstream upgrade. So in those cases, that would help with some ratepayer costs that we see, ratepayer impacts from big, expensive, lengthy upstream upgrades. So this also, flexible service connection also means better optimization of existing grid infrastructure. So you're seeing more efficient utilization of the system as it is today. So that's also just better for the grid and more efficient, and can also potentially put downward pressure on rates.
Yeah, I think Casey covered a lot there, and I guess I could touch on timelines in particular, and using flexible service connection and adding the associated controls, so albeit power control system or DERMS, it can be a lot faster solution to connecting projects to the grid than a conventional grid upgrade, like constructing a dedicated feeder. There was the three investor-owned utilities in California a few years ago put together some reporting and some estimates. They found that the average circuit upgrade would take them over 2 years. The average substation upgrade would require more than 4 years, and constructing a new substation would require nearly 10 years. So certainly flexible service connection can get you there a lot faster. And having this option allows you to avoid that incredibly lengthy delays. And I do want to touch on an example of using sort of a crude example of using flexible service connection. So let's say you have like a 3 megawatt EV charging depot, and these projects are really large, multi-megawatt projects. Let's say it's being reviewed by the utility, and the utility does its analysis, and it finds that within the summer months, at 5 to 7 p.m., the grid is constrained, and this project just won't be approved. It can't provide that full capacity, especially because of the grid constraints at that time. Perhaps the rest of the entire year, there's plenty of headroom on the grid. Still, that project would trigger a grid upgrade. Well, with flexible service connection, the customer could receive that information, and they say, well, what if we limit our power during those constrained time periods? So rather than needing 3 megawatts, we'll limit our import to 1 megawatt during those time periods. And so that project is avoiding its grid constraints, avoiding grid upgrades, and it's getting connected a lot faster. So although the owner may have to operate the site differently, the project can start operating and generating revenue much sooner.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay and Casey. So next question is, what are the key considerations when starting to design a flexible service connection program?
I can kick us off again. I think the most important consideration overall is that there's no one size fits all approach to flexible service connection. So you can have really, really simple options ranging to more complex options. But the first thing you want to consider is what is the load limit going to need to be? So like the slide says, we can have static limits, which means that you have, and there's debate over how you actually define what static versus dynamic really means, but the simplest way of thinking about it is a static limit is not going to change. So one of the ways you can think about this is that if you have an EV charger that's connecting at like half of its rated capacity, and it doesn't change. So the limit would be half of whatever the rated capacity is year round. You can also have those vary by season. And then you have that increase in complexity all the way to a potentially dynamic limit. So what we're seeing through PG&E is day ahead limits that vary. They get a 24-hour notice on what the limit is going to be. But potentially would like to see some utilities with the DERMS work toward potentially real-time limits. So yeah, first consideration is the load limit. Second is going to be whether there's what kind of compliance mechanism you need. So again, this can be simplistic to most complex. PG&E has a load limit letter process that it uses. So basically, they don't actually have any kind of real enforcement, they follow up if like after the fact using AMI data, they can verify that customers are staying below the limit. But you can potentially have operational enforcement that would cut off power when it reaches a certain limit. So there's different options for that. And then eventually we would like to see some kind of policy, maybe reward customers that are foregoing capacity long term. That's something to consider as well. But yeah, overall, just like what is the use case? What's going to benefit the customer and the utility, and allow the customer to like understand the flexible interconnection, because the customer needs to know what their limit is, especially if it varies day by day, and just how that's going to be enforced. And I'll pass it to Dave if maybe he wants to add something to that.
Yeah. So I think another consideration is if this is going to be a bridging program or a non-bridging solution program. And so what I mean by bridging is basically temporary. So a bridging solution allows load to connect quickly and operate at a partial capacity until the utility completes a grid upgrade, at which point the project can operate at full capacity. Non-bridging, on the other hand, is a more permanent solution that allows the load to connect quickly and permanently operate at partial capacity or below full capacity. And so the non-bridging helps to avoid grid upgrades and maximizes grid utilization. And this option can meet many customers' operational needs if the incentives and compensation are structured well for the customer's flexibility. And so this can, the choice between it being a bridging or a non-bridging solution can have a really big impact on the design, program design, related to the structure of the process steps for the utilities work, and then the incentives and the compensation. And then another consideration is if this program will use local or external controls. And so local controls, you'd think of certified power control systems, real-time automation controller or RTAC, or maybe a volt-watt function within smart inverters. And so these often rely on devices that are readily available today and that can be deployed at a relatively low cost. Compare that to external controls. And so thinking of DERMS, like distributed energy resource management systems, these allow the program to have real-time curtailment of these projects, but they're in very early stages of deployment throughout the country. I think only a few utilities have deployed them.
Thanks, Dave and Casey. We have one more question here, but we're running up on time a little bit, so might need you all to stick with about a minute each so we can get to audience Q&A. And again, a reminder to put in your questions if you have them. So for this next question, it's what states are leading the way on flexible service connection and what are lessons learned? And you can just focus on one since this is a bigger question to save time.
Yeah, I can take that. So, I think the state leading the way would be California. They just finalized what is called the limited load profile, and so that is a static, schedule-based, flexible service connection program. And so I think that is really exciting opportunity that provides the customer to avoid some of those grid constraints. So it's really exciting, and we're excited to see where it goes and the uptake from customers. Related to some lessons learned, I'd say, initial grid transparency is really important when considering flexible service connection. So just giving customers insight into available capacity and the costs of grid upgrades is important.
Yeah, I would just add to what Dave said. Yeah, the CPUC also recently handed down a decision like implementing a standard framework for flexible interconnection. So based off of PG&E's load limit letter, which is a very simple static or a very simple like method for implementing a flexible service connection. So adding that, yeah, California is definitely leading the way on this, but we're definitely seeing a lot of movement in New York. New York is very interested in grid modernization in general, and utilities like Con Edison are embracing the concept of flexible interconnection and piloting it. And other states are potentially interested in load flexibility and grid modernization more generally. And so we think that it's going to be a short while until we start seeing more states embrace flexible interconnection. And I would also add that a lesson learned about flexible interconnection that we hear from customers on occasion is that they just want certainty about what their load limits are going to be. That doesn't necessarily mean a static interconnection, but I think it's that certain types of customers want to know what the margin of flexibility is going to be, and they want transparency from the utility about what. So, for instance, with EV charging and medium and heavy duty charging, this is important that customers know what to expect.
Great, thank you both. So moving on, just really quickly, we're going to cover some upcoming opportunities. So this is a really quick round for everyone. So I will kick us off in terms of the timelines, where we're looking at opportunities to set target timelines. Casey actually mentioned this before, but both Colorado and Illinois had legislation that passed or got enacted last year. So we're planning to, work on those states once those opportunities come up. And then we're also staying engaged in California and New York to think through other timeline solutions there, or to further refine them in both of those states. Midhat, what's going on with grid transparency coming up?
Yeah, we were involved most of last year and at the beginning of this year in Colorado. So there's going to be a lot of implementation timelines. I mean, implementation with regards to HCA. As of this month, the Excel now is required to publish nodal level data. So they're going to do that. And then they'll be transitioning into monthly updates. And then they'll be required to even provide the basic stuff I mentioned earlier about like user guides. And then they have to move away from requiring that NDA, non-disclosure agreement, to access the load hosting capacity. And then, so these are different timelines that the commission has set for Excel to abide with or implement in terms of the HCA. And leading into next year, December 2027, they'll be required to post or to provide dynamic HCA, so more of a time series HCA, like 576 analysis. So yeah, it's an exciting time to look at how that changes, especially with Colorado, given we went away from having to sign NDAs to even to see the basic grid data related to load. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, Dave and Casey, if you want to add really quickly what's going on with flexible service connections or timelines for you, Casey, as well. Feel free to add those.
I can just briefly say that EDF is definitely engaged in load flexibility policies in a number of states. We're working a lot with utilities to get some pilots off the ground, particularly New York, New Jersey, and Texas.
Yeah, I'd say Illinois has an ongoing working group that is both flexible interconnection, flexible service connection, Ameren in particular, Ameren, Illinois. And then Colorado is another state that we're keeping our eye on flexible service connection.
Great. Thank you so much. And I should have introduced Gwen Brown, who is our VP of Communications at IREC before, but she's been helping behind the scenes get all of the questions in order. And then Caitlin Sweeney, who's on the regulatory program, has also been helping. So thank you to both of you. And Gwen is going to moderate the Q&A part here.
Thanks, Mary. And great to be here with you all today. We've gotten a lot of great questions in both the Q&A section, and I've grabbed a few from the chat as well. We've got a little under 10 minutes, so I'm gonna try to get through as many of our questions as possible, but there may be a few that we don't get through, so we'll do our best. But to kick things off, we have a question from Martin about what are the energization process steps that we're referring to? I know it can be a somewhat opaque process. So I think hearing from some of you on what the process actually looks like in terms of the steps would be great.
This is making me wish that we had put a really good graphic in there because we have a couple of them. And one, maybe we can link to this resource when we send out the webinar slides and recordings, but we worked with EPRI on a paper recently on a roadmap related to EV service connection process. And it has a really great, maybe a little overwhelming process, but it's really great. And it lays out the different steps and who's responsible, because that's also a really important part of this. So I'm not going to go through all of them because if you look at them, it's quite a big number of them. But what we kind of talk about in that roadmap is, typically when you think about a process, you start from the application step. This is when the application is being submitted. But what we talk about is what's really important is what comes before that. So some of the stuff that Midhat was talking about in terms of grid transparency and what is provided to the customer before the application gets submitted is super important. So we would actually start the process really at that point. Like, what information is provided? What does the customer have access to? And how good is that information? To then be able to submit an application for a site that will more likely, get energized because it's something that maybe won't require as many upgrades or as expensive upgrades. So going from application, basically you're talking about how does the process get reviewed? So there's a step of, engineering review. There's cost estimates and signing agreements to be able to move forward. And then if there's construction needed of grid upgrades or, interconnection facilities, making sure that you have some estimates of timing for those steps, inspection, testing, commissioning, and then energization. What we keep talking about, that the final part of this is that the site can come online and you can actually be able to import energy to that site. So yeah, it may look a little bit different, but mostly a lot of the steps will line up from place to place. And then, like I said, what's really important too is looking at who's responsible for each step, because it's not just the utility. There's a lot of, issues, things that customers have to do, like make sure that they have an easement, that, there's an agreement. If they don't own the land, is there an easement so the utility can come on and, work on any kind of equipment on the utility side within that property. So there are a lot of different things that, you have to work through that full process. But we will send out that report so you can have that very, long, but like good visual about the energization process.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary. And actually, it looks like Catherine at EPRI dropped a link to the chat or to the report that you mentioned with that graphic in the chat.
Awesome.
So folks can check that out. Thank you, Catherine. Next up, we have a question from Fred about how would we suggest incorporating energization timeline requirements into a utility rate case? And I think this raises some valuable strategy questions.
I can take a crack at this one. So I'm not sure a utility rate case is the right venue to decide these policies. A rate case tends to revolve a lot more around like dollars and cents and in utility investments. So we would rather see energization timelines decided as part of a standard framework. So like, for instance, with the energization timelines proceeding in California, that's a general PUC proceeding. So it can kind of set like a standard energization timeline for all of the major utilities rather than just case by case.
Thanks, Casey. Anything others want to add before I jump on to our next question? All right. Moving on, we have a question from Caitlin. In our work, have we found that the grid transparency tools are intuitive for public and or fleet use? Or do they require a third party, such as a consulting firm, to interpret them? And Midha, I know you touched a little bit on this, so maybe I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And in my experience, I think the answer is a bit of both, depending on how the tool is designed. We have definitely seen progress in HCA tools. Many hosting capacity maps today are much more user-friendly than they were a few years ago, with clearer visuals, better interface, and more accessible. For a public user or a fleet developer who's just trying to screen locations at a high level, those tools can absolutely be intuitive and useful on their own. That said, I think when you start getting into project level decisions, the interpretation becomes more nuanced. Understanding the actual constraints, whether voltage, thermal, or protection, and by how much those constraints are limiting the capacity, uh, often require some level of experience. And I think developers often um, uh, work with utilities or plan ahead with third parties in terms of evaluating those individual projects while still using a lot of the inputs that is offered in the HCA results.
Awesome. Thanks, Midhat. We have another question. This one's from Linda, who asks, who owns or operates flexible service connections, the utilities or the EV station owner? And I think that's a great question about just kind of how the process actually works.
I can quickly answer this one. So a flexible service connection is essentially a contract between the customer and the utility. So it's not necessarily like an owned service. It's basically an agreement where the customer is saying, I will limit my load to this much, and the utility then, sets the contractual like uh, terms to that agreement. So when it comes to like who owns the actual hardware, there are differences. Like, so depending on the flexible interconnection, you can have the customer side, like technology that might be owned by the customer, but the utility owns everything that's not behind the customer meter. So it's a little bit complicated, but essentially it is just like a contract between the customer and the utility. There's some things that are owned, some hardware owned by the customer, some hardware owned by the utility.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. We have another question about whether flexible service connections can work for all projects, or are there limits or just particular projects that this is only viable for?
Yeah, I can touch on it, then Casey, you can take it. So I'd say it's probably most ideal for large projects, large EV charging station projects, because they are going to be facing really lengthy grid upgrades because they are just these massive projects. And so unlike projects of comparable size, so think a large industrial plant, data center, medium heavy duty charging stations don't take years and years to build because they require relatively little supporting infrastructure beyond the electrical equipment and the charger itself. And so as a result, utilities are being asked to upgrade distribution infrastructure on a much shorter time frame compared to these other types of load. And because these EV charging infrastructure projects kind of like need their power as soon as they're built, sort of to pencil out. So I'd say it's really valuable for large EVSC projects.
Awesome. We also have a question about the difference between static and dynamic flexible service connections and whether one is preferred. And Casey, I know that you did touch a little bit on the differences, but if there's anything you want to add, that would be great.
Yeah, just quickly to say that again, like there is no one size fits all. There's definitely no preferred option. It will just really depend on like the utilities operating capabilities and like the customer need. So just whatever works best for the customer and the utilities system.
Awesome, thanks. And I mentioned this in a reply in the Q&A, but IREC has a forthcoming article in Public Utilities Fortnightly that it'll be coming out in April, so it'll be a little bit after we share the recording, but that is going to delve into this much more deeply. So we will look for opportunities to share that with you all. We also have a question about whether extended range electric vehicles, Fred notes extended range electric vehicles or EREVs can take pressure off of the near term for need for public charging infrastructure. And they are wondering, is anyone working with states to provide EREV incentives in exchange for relaxing the timelines or deploying public charging infrastructure?
I was going on camera to say that I know we're at time. I don't have a good answer for this question, even though I think it's a great question. We haven't been working on the incentive side as much, so we're not as in tune to what's going on there. But yeah, that sounds like something that would be great. That I hope that someone is tackling that if they aren't. But I wanted to go ahead and launch our final poll or two questions here. And also just wanted to thank everyone for joining. A big thank you to Casey with EDF and my fellow IREC colleagues, Dave and Midhat, for being panelists, and to Gwen and Caitlin for supporting this, and Michelle, our other colleague who was not on the call today. But so we've included our websites, or I guess you can scan for our website and scan to subscribe to our newsletter at IREC, and then EDF's website is edf.org to learn more information there. So please check those out, and please reach out to us if you have questions that weren't answered today. We're going to send out the slides and recording, like I said, within about a week. So stay tuned for that. And once again, thank you all for attending. And with that, I think we can go ahead and close the webinar.